This is Peter Helland on the show Israel. The title there is Patriarchy and Politics. I happened to come across a dissertation out of Baylor University. It was finished in 2006 by a fellow named Davenport. And it was dealing with, the title of it was Patriarchy and Politics, and he singled out Robert Filmer and Robert Lewis Dabney. Now, people here locally, South Bend, public access, probably for maybe 25 years ago, I talked a lot on Robert Lewis Dabney. And he was considered the best theologian in the country by the president of Princeton Seminary. In fact, he said, if not the world. And Stonewall Jackson chose him to be his chief of staff for 6 months, right in the thickest of the battles. And the reason Jackson chose him is that Jackson was extremely devoted Christian, and he wanted the best theologian at his side, guiding his purpose. We're going to look at patriarchy, and then we're going to try to zero in on the husband-wife relationship, or the relationship of the man with the woman, because that's really where everything is happening. The scripture that we can look at here that very few people even know about it, it's in the book of Jude, verse 14, and it says here, and Enoch, also the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, behold, the Lord comes with 10,000 of his saints to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches, which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are murmurers and complainers, walking after their own lusts, and their mouth speaks great swelling words, having men's persons in admiration because of advantage. So here's Jude quoting from Enoch. Now, if you go back to Genesis, Jude says Enoch is the seventh from Adam. And the 10th from Adam is Noah. So Enoch had Methuselah, and after Methuselah, you're coming up on Lamech, Noah's father. So it's 10 from Adam is Noah. The seventh is Enoch, and it says Enoch walked with God, and at the age of 350, he was taken up. He just disappeared. He went right up with God. And I suppose that's like, for the modern scientific mind, that's like the whale swallowed Jonah. These things are simply not believed by modern man. But here's Jude quoting Enoch, who's giving a prophecy of judgment in the last days. But it's Adam is the reality, okay? Adam is the reality that has been destroyed. It's been destroyed theologically, and he's been destroyed politically. Now, we've been through John Zahm. The 100th anniversary of Zahm is coming up. And Zahm led the way to bring in evolution into the teaching of the Catholic Church. And if you want to really look at some new good articles, the Colby Center, it's like the only Catholic creationist organization out there. Most all of them have been Protestant. But just recently, Hugh Owens has started up Catholic creationist sites, believing in special creation as opposed to evolution. But Zahm led the way, came to Notre Dame in 1867. For a while, he sat under Orestes Bronson, who was vehemently against evolution. But for some reason, between 1883 and 1893, Zahm completely switched and fully embraced evolution. And then Notre Dame, eventually, by the time my dad went there, he was studying under John O'Brien. O'Brien followed very closely to Zahm, and by the time I got there, the priests were teaching pure evolution, super strong. And that's all anybody ever got, probably from every single teacher. I don't think there would have been a creationist teacher that anybody would have came across. So, people think, well, what's the big deal? The big deal is, I went to a seminar or a lecture series. It was 2 PhD candidates, I think on the East Coast, and they were talking about marriage. And I asked them, well, is it important? Jesus in Matthew 19 seemed to place marriage on a historical context. And I said, is it important that history be true? Or could it be a myth? And they said, no, it can easily be a myth. Well, Father Miss Campbell came up to me afterwards and said, well, that was a good question. Well, yeah, it's a good question, because if Adam and Eve are not historically true according to the Scripture, in other words, Enoch is the seventh from Adam, and you start with Adam, it tells exactly how old Adam was when he died, and then his son Seth, it says exactly how old he was. And then Enos, every age, it's precise exactly how old they were when they died, when they were born. The genealogy goes all the way up to Christ. In fact, believing in Jesus is believing in who he is. And 90 times about in the New Testament, he is referred to either by himself or by an author as the Son of Man. In the Hebrew, Adam, the son of Adam. And there's huge controversy on exactly what that means. I mean, everything is on the table. So how do you know? Well, to me, the scholars that are arguing that that Jesus is identifying himself as the son of Adam. That's what the genealogies describe him as. He is the son of Adam. He's the son of Joseph. He's the son of David. But ultimately, he's mainly the son of the Adam, the historical Adam. And that is the issue. Patriarchy rises and falls, maintains itself on the existence of the historical Adam. And once you change that Adam, he didn't really live 930 years and die. He wasn't really created by God from the dust of the ground on the sixth day. Once you tamper with that, you're tampering with patriarchy. You are now confusing the sexes. And we see that theologically and politically. To locate the problem, let's read Dabney. And then where this problem comes from, we'll get into it. So he wrote an article, I think it was in the 1870s, and it's a tremendous article. It's called Women's Rights, Women. I don't think anybody comes close to being a forceful writer like Dabney in the whole history of the country. His ability to nail things down with the precise word and nail the issue, never seen anybody better. And I discovered him 25 years ago, and I still don't think there's anybody better. He starts out the article, in our day, innovations march with so rapid a stride that they quite take away one's breath. The fantastical project of yesterday, which was mentioned only to be ridiculed, is today the audacious reform and will be tomorrow the accomplished fact. That's how he writes. I had memorized one thing that he said. I used to say it on the show all the time. So let me just read that, which I had memorized, and we'll locate the problem. So he's talking about the North winning the war and their concept, their ideology, destroying the husband and wife relationship. Absolutely destroying, because now marriage has to be totally equal. Obedience of children to parents is going to be destroyed. The whole thing is going to be destroyed. Dabney saw that very clear. In fact, he let me state exactly how he saw it, and then you can understand why he saw it. He says the advocates of these women's rights may be expected to win the day because the premises from which they argue their revolution have been irrevocably admitted by the bulk of the people. Now, this popular mind may not be consciously or intentionally consistent and logical. It may jump to many conclusions without much analysis of the steps by which they are reached. It may deliberately harbor the most express purpose to be guilty of any logical inconsistency, however outrageous, in pursuing its supposed interest, and may have its mind ever so clearly made up to eat its own words and principles whenever its convenience prompts that measure. But still, the Creator has made man, in spite of himself, a logical animal. And consequences will work themselves out whether he designs it or not to those results which the premises dictate. History will write out the corollaries of the theorems whether the projectors wish to stop for them or not. Now, false principles are already firmly planted from which the whole women's rights claim must follow. And he says, or if we examine the argument in its more exact and logical form, we shall find it, after the established false premises are granted, equally conclusive for the educated. The very axioms of American politics now are that, quote, all men are by nature equal, that all are inalienably entitled to liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and that the only just foundation of government is in the consent of the governed. And he explains how that has been twisted to become very anti-Christian. The Southerners took it, Dabney argued, and made it Christian. So it was how they were going to take that. Then he gets to what the result of taking that ideology the wrong way and how it applies to marriage. Slavery is now abolished, so that issue has its own issue. But marriage is now what's at risk after the Civil War. And he writes, the abolition of marriage would follow again by another cause. Okay, and he was talking about first, women won't even be attracted to men because the men will become effeminate, the women will become masculine, and the attraction will be gone. Okay, so marriage will be dissolved based on that, but also he says, the divergent interest and the rival independence of the two equal wills would be irreconcilable with domestic government or union or peace. Shall the children of this monstrous no union be held responsible to two variant, coordinate, and supreme wills at once? Heaven pity the children. See, it didn't work itself out, but Dabney could see this is going to work itself out. A little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. And now we're seeing it. We're seeing these young people burning down buildings. And you listen to the older people, what do they say? Well, these are the timeout kids. These are 2-year-old temper tantrums. These are kids where in the old days, the parent would say, basically coming out of World War II, I brought you in, I'll take you out. Okay. Now that's how it's supposed to be. They did bring you in, and they have a duty to take you out, actually. If you read the Old Testament and New Testament, if you read Jesus saying, if somebody speaks evil of his parents, they're to be put to death. Now, how that's interpreted, I leave that to the leaders of the church. But we know at least this. God did not put up with rebellion anywhere. In the home, a kid smarting off to the parent, that was not put up with. But now the parents are putting up with everything. And in many cases, the little children run the home. Because now it's come full circle. So he writes, heaven pity the children. Shall the two parties to this perpetual co-partnership have neither the power to secure the performance of the mutual duties nor to dissolve it? It is a self-contradiction, an impossible absurdity. Such a co-partnership of equals with independent interests must be separable at will, as all other such co-partnerships are. The only relation between the sexes which will remain will be a cohabitation, continuing so long as the convenience or caprice of both parties may suggest. And this, with most, will amount to a vagrant concubinage. Now, this next paragraph I had memorized. I don't have it in my memory now, but I used to repeat it all the time because I loved what he said. So he writes, "But now, what will be the character of the children reared under such a domestic organization as this? If human experience has established anything at all, it is the truth of that principle announced by the Hebrew prophet when he declared that the great aim of God in ordaining a permanent marriage tie between one man and one woman was, quote out of Malachi, that he might seek a godly seed. God's ordinance, the only effective human ordinance for checking and curbing the first tendencies to evil, is domestic parental government. When the family shall no longer have a head, and the great foundation for the subordination of children in the mother's example is gone, when the mother shall have found another sphere than her home for her energies, when she shall have exchanged the sweet charities of domestic love and sympathy for the fierce passions of the hustings is marketplace, when family shall be disrupted at the caprice of either party, and the children scattered as foundlings from their hearthstone, it requires no wisdom to see that a race of sons will be reared nearer akin to devils than to men. In the hands of such a bastard progeny, without discipline, without homes, without a God, the last remains of social order will speedily perish, and society will be overwhelmed in savage anarchy." Now, when I would say that here locally on the public access 25 years ago, we weren't having people go downtown Chicago on a lie and destroy the buildings and just loot and destroy. But now we're seeing what happens when the northern ideology of radical democracy takes hold, where the woman is equal to the man in the home. Nobody's in charge. She doesn't have to obey the husband any more than he has to obey her. They just have to figure it out. And these kids are kind of like, oh, there's two bosses. There's two truths. Two bosses in the home. Well, you can't have two truths. It's called cognitive dissonance. It's called, you can't believe in two truths at the same time. Which one is it? Who's in charge? Philosophically, do you believe in evolution or do you believe in creation? Well, the Catholic Church, Notre Dame, they teach both. We believe in evolution and we believe the Bible. Well, which one? You can't have both. They contradict. Well, we don't believe they contradict. Well, all the church fathers said, up till Zahm, they all said it contradicted. Bronson was vehement. He's buried at the Basilica. He said it contradicts. But when you go with evolution, you lose Adam. And if you lose Adam, you lose patriarchy. And if you lose Adam, there's no authority in the home. Where does the authority come from? So Dabney closes his article, and you should try to read that, Women's Rights Women. I'm sure you can get it on the internet. And he says, thus will be consummated that destiny to which so many gloomy prognostics point as the allotment of the North American continent, to be the accursed field for the final illustration of the harvest of perdition, grown from the seeding of the dragon's teeth of infidel radicalism. And he quotes, he finishes, must not God be avenged on such a nation as this? His vengeance will be to give them the fruit of their own hands and let them be filled with their own devices. He will set apart this fair land by a sort of dread consecration, to the purpose of giving a lesson concerning this godless philosophy, so impressive as to instruct and warn all future generations. As the dull and pestilential waves of the Dead Sea have been to every subsequent age the memento of the sin of Sodom, so the dreary tides of anarchy and barbarism, which will overwhelm the boastful devices of infidel democracy, will be the caution of all future legislators. And thus women's rights will assist America to fulfill her great mission, that of being the scarecrow of the nations. And Dabney lived till about 1896. Now, he's not saying anything different than what John Wesley and John Fletcher said, the founders of the Methodist Church. Let's go back to Fletcher again. Fletcher, in 1776, wrote this book. And I thought this book was so important, I got on like like antique books. There was 4 copies available left, and I got one of the last 4. It was very expensive. But I figure it's kind of like, wow, this book told the truth in 1776. The same as Dabney's saying. In the pamphlet war, but unfortunately, Thomas Paine, Lincoln's favorite, he won that pamphlet war, Common Sense. John Adams said it was basically Thomas Paine. He said the revolution couldn't have taken place without Thomas Paine, with that propaganda. But Fletcher wrote, confronting the American patriots, he wrote, "The American patriotism farther confronted with reason, scripture, and the Constitution, observations on the dangerous politics taught by Mr. Evans and Dr. Price with a scriptural plea for the revolted colonies." He says the same thing as Dabney, but addressing the time there. So he writes, talking about this book, those whom, somebody has given the preface here, those whom Fletcher encounters in these sheets are the leading ecclesiastical patriots of the 2 greatest cities in the British kingdom, Mr. Evans being the champion of the minority in Bristol, as Dr. Price is in London. The capital arguments of these 2 gentlemen are here brought to a triple test, against which they cannot decently object. And if the author's execution keeps pace with his design, their politics are proved to be contrary to reason, scripture, and the Constitution. So the issue there back then in 1776 was slavery or freedom. That was the constant theme, slavery or freedom. And basically, anytime somebody is telling you what to do, then you're a slave. Fletcher writes, talking about the theology of Price and Evans. The most abject slave in the universe may chance to have a very good master, but still, if he is at the disposal of his master, he is equally a slave when treated well as when treated ill. And he repeats that theme over and over. A slave is equally a slave when treated well as when treated ill. And you might have added, a subject is equally a subject when treated well as when treated ill. Okay, and then he quotes, but the scripture says, let every soul be subject to the higher powers. Why do you think people were called subjects? Because Romans 13, let every soul be subject to the higher powers. So he says, to oppose the scriptural doctrine, which the patriots were, he said, is to overthrow subjection and government which stand or fall together. So that was his theme. But let's get back to Adam. So Fletcher writes in his little chapter here, a word about the origin of power. I believe with St. Paul that the powers that are ordained of God, who is the fountain of all power and the author of all good government. I date the divine communication of power from the paradisical age, yea, from the hour in which God said to Adam and Eve, multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over every living thing. Here, sir, writing to Evans and Price, here, sir, is the original grant of power, and whosoever wantonly resists the power which providence calls him to obey, breaks this great political charter of God, which is so strongly and so frequently confirmed in the gospel. And then he challenges Price on the main point. And this is the point you've got to really come to grips with, because we have been never allowed to go to this point. And once you get this right, everything will start falling in place. Fletcher comments to Price. He says, but you add on page 75, Price is the other guy, the opponent, says, when Adam became a father, he had as much power as any other father. And on page 77, you ask, does not every father receive the same divine right of dominion? Okay, what we're getting into here is Dabney and Fletcher are arguing against John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, their notion of the social contract theory, that we're all basically born free. But the truth is, the looters and the rioters and everybody out there that's being rebellious are like a 2-year-old on a temper tantrum. Why? Because what happens when you're 2? There's this idea that, hold it here, you don't want to submit. You want to be in charge. Okay? That would be much better. Do I have to submit to this whole thing that's out here? I got to submit to my parents. I got to submit. Oh my goodness, this is terrible. And so you challenge it, and your parents challenge you back and put you in your place. But what happens if the 2-year-old wins? What happens if the parents think it's cute? They have this ideology that says, well, whatever the kid does, it's beautiful. So they don't discipline him and they don't put him in check. They don't give him the traditional discipline that they used to get. In fact, they just let him go. And he can follow his fantasy that he should be in charge. Well, that's what you got. But the parents raise them that way because they believe a certain way. And at the root of it is this notion called the social contract theory, that everybody is really born independent and free of anything. That's our natural state. And the goal is to always get back to the natural state. Okay, we'll try to get back to that. That's something you got to really get into your head, because this is where it all comes from. Does not every father receive the same divine right of dominion, asserting that there is nothing to be inferred from the parental authority of Adam, but is equally applicable to all parents without exception? Fletcher responds. He says, I reply that it is contrary to all divinity to say that every parent is endued with all the authority which Adam was invested with when God said to him, subdue the earth and have dominion. You are too judicious a divine not to speak a different language in the pulpit. You know, sir, that Adam was invested with characters which he could not communicate to all his posterity, and which consequently are not common to all men. A simile will possibly convince you of your mistake. King George III is with respect to his children what Adam was with respect to his posterity. He is a father and a king. The first character he can entail upon all his sons, but the second he can entail upon none but the Prince of Wales. Okay? So not everybody can be who Adam was. Adam died at 930 years. But let's say Adam, for some reason, didn't sin and lived on. So now we're on the earth that Adam, 6,000 years ago, continues obeying God's command to take dominion. Would Adam be in charge of everything on the earth? Of course he would. He'd be the dictator. He'd be the benevolent dictator. And Jesus, as the son of Adam, That's his identity, 90 times, the son of Adam. He would not have had to come. Okay? He wouldn't have to come and died for us and then take charge again, and that the new heaven and the new earth wouldn't have to happen. But on the new earth, Christ is going to rule. He will be the last Adam, the second man. But his identity is, Jesus' identity is Adam. Adam is everything. The Catholic Bible, the book of Sirach, says Adam is to be honored above all men, obviously. And what happens if he's not honored above all men? Disaster. Disaster. Because if you don't honor your parents and you speak evil of your parents, you're to be put to death. And you don't honor Adam above all, expect spiritual death. Expect it. And it's been happening. Then he writes, you try to embarrass the question by saying, you must tell us who is Adam's heir. Okay, here's another key issue that you have to really wrestle with. Okay, so Fletcher is saying to Price writes on page 79, Price writes, you must tell us who is Adam's heir. What does it signify what power Adam had or what power he left behind him to his governing successors unless we certainly know who those successors are? Okay, now this brings in primogeniture, which is tied as the cornerstone of patriarchy. When the father dies, the oldest son takes his place. That's just how it is. When the king died, the Prince of Wales, the oldest son, takes the king's place. Without that transition, it's all lost. Fletcher says, but I reply that in every country, those who share in the dominion given to Adam and Eve in their regal, kingly capacity are as much known as the king and parliament are known in England, the dog and Senate at Venice, the emperor and diet in Germany, the monarch in France, and the despot in Prussia. Whoever by the good providence of God is endued with the legislative and protective power in the country where I reside and retains that power by the consent of a majority of the people is the higher power which I consider as actually ordained of God for my protection. To that power I will cheerfully submit so far as it is used for good. Romans 13 says the powers that be are ordained of God. And you resist those powers, you're resisting God. It's like parents, Well, how do I know that's my real dad? Well, is he functioning in the office of your dad? Then honor him and obey him. Well, I don't know if he's really my dad. Well, how about my stepdad? That's just, how did he say it in the Old English? You try to embarrass the question, okay? Quit embarrassing the question. Well, is that my real mom? Well, you probably know it's your real mom. You may not know that's your real dad, but it's not an issue. Just obey who you're supposed to obey. So he quotes Price, and here page 71 of Price. He quotes him, perhaps you will say the supreme power in every government must be lodged somewhere, and this power must be omnipotent and uncontrollable. I allow it. Price writes, but the glory of the British Constitution is that the people have never parted with this power, but have most religiously kept it in their own hands. Fletcher responds, thus, sir, according to your doctrine, the supreme and governing power belongs not to the governors, but to the people, that is, to the governed. Was ever a more preposterous doctrine imposed upon injudicious patriots? Oh, sir, what you call the glory of the British Constitution would be the shame of the worst government. Nay, upon this plan, there could be no government at all. For so long as the governed most religiously, should you not have said most impiously and absurdly, keep the governing power in their own hands, that power is in everybody's hands. And the moment this is the case, there is an end of government, anarchy takes place, King Ma breaks all the laws with a high hand, and a tyrannical populace fiercely trample upon all order and carry devastation wherever they turn their steps. Well, it's come full circle. Dabney said it is going to come because the northern ideology, which came out of the communist movement, 1848. Almost every country in Europe had a huge communist revolution, and it failed. And by the millions, they came over here, they joined Lincoln's army, and they won. And that principle of radical equality, a godless radical equality, got root into the country. It was already there in 1776, as Fletcher points out. And the Southerners were trying to get it back on a Christian base. The first thing they did when they seceded was put God back in the Constitution. But in the providence of God, they lost. And it could be because of their sins. So he writes, he says, "Thus, sir, you have helped me to prove the truth of this deep proposition of judicious Mr. Baxter, who, after having studied Christian politics near 30 years, left it upon record that, quote, if once legislation, the chief act of government, be denied to be any part of government at all, and affirmed to belong to the people as such, who are no governors, all government will thereby be overthrown." So you're going to say authority comes from the people? Not from Jesus Christ, not from God. Government's ordained by the people. It's not ordained by God. That's where it's going to go. In fact, the guy who wrote the book, Davenport, Patriarchy and Politics, he has a little quote. Trying to think who said it. But the guy who said it said, the first Whig, the devil was the first Whig, okay? So Lincoln, of course, was a Whig. And I'm not an expert on that at all. So let's get right to the issue again, because it says here, pass we on to his doctrine concerning the origin of power. So we're going back to Adam again. Price writes, according to these opinions that he doesn't agree with, government is not the creature of the people or the result of a convention between them and their rulers. But there are certain men who possess in themselves, independently on the will of the people, a right of governing them, which they derive from the deity. Okay, divine right of kings, however you want to say it. From this quotation, it is evident that according to Dr. Price's principles, and your own, Fletcher writes, government is the creature of the people. In full opposition to this doctrine, I assert that government is the creature of God. We totally go, Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we vehemently hold government of the people, by the people, for the people. The Constitution, they refused, and they never wanted to amend it. Movements like crazy to amend the Constitution and acknowledge God. The only movement that acknowledged God in the Constitution was the Confederacy. And they got destroyed. And any movement, any proposal to say the Constitution should acknowledge God gets destroyed in this country. People hate the idea that we're going to acknowledge God. Romans 1 says, because they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over, men lusting for men, women lusting for women. To acknowledge God is the highest duty of man. The highest duty of the law is to acknowledge God, and our law doesn't acknowledge him. Can you get any worse than that? Fletcher was on top of it. He says, in full opposition to this doctrine, I assert that government is the creature of God. It is as absurd to say that government is the creature of the people as to maintain that religion and marriage are the creatures of the people. He writes, when God said, I will make man and help meet for him, and join Adam and Eve together in their human capacity, bidding them increase and multiply, he instituted marriage. And when he said to them in their regal, kingly capacity, have dominion, he delegated governing power and instituted government on earth. I mean, you need to read this because it is so good, but we only have so much time. So he says, nevertheless, the consent, he talks about the consent of the people is necessary, okay? You can't, if your wife doesn't consent to obey you, the marriage can't go forward, okay? And if the soldiers aren't willing to obey their general, that army is going to go nowhere. But he writes, nevertheless, the consent of the people to be governed by their sovereign and of the soldiers to be commanded by their general is not the ground or origin of the sovereign's and the general's authority. It is only causa sine qua non, a requisite, without which sovereigns and generals cannot exercise their authority. Some illustrations may help you to understand this nice point of doctrine. Men are bound to pay God a reasonable service, whether they will or not. A wife is bound to obey her husband in all reasonable things, whether willingly or unwillingly. And subjects are bound to obey their sovereign in all reasonable and lawful things, however averse they may be to it. Nor is it less absurd to make a lawful sovereign's claim to the obedience of his subjects depend upon their will than to make the right which a husband has of ruling his wife depend upon her caprice, or the right which God has to our adoration turn upon our consent. Nevertheless, if wives will absolutely refuse to submit to their husbands, sinners to their God, and subjects to their king, they can shake off the yoke of subjection and effect domestic, religious, and civil independence. But then the purposes of marriage, religion, and government are defeated, and a threefold rebellion takes place. It will be proper here to trace back to its source the error about liberty which Dr. Price has adopted from Rousseau, the great Geneva patriot. And he goes back and the whole idea that we were born as a savage in the wild, doesn't have any government, and he's free. And basically that's how they viewed America. America was going to be this place of radical freedom, individual freedom. We're going to restore this original savage state, because that's our real state, is total independence. And he writes, a fatal error this, by which the fanciful politician, Rousseau, has kindled the flame of discord in his own country. This error consists in inferring that because a savage who lives alone in a wood is his own governor and can legislate for himself, a man who lives in civil society can do the same. Now, this is insanity, but this is totally how every aspect of our government presupposes this. With Lincoln winning the Civil War, all the states have to live under this presupposition. But is not this as absurd as to suppose that because a man who is not enlisted in the army, and of course is under no military government, can go backward or forward when he pleases? Therefore, a soldier in the field of battle has a right to legislate for himself and advance or retire just when he thinks proper. But that was back when every man had to basically serve in the military. From the whole, I hope I may safely conclude that the foundation of Dr. Price's peculiar patriotism is laid in a gross mistake, a mistake which consists in confounding the lawless liberty of a savage who lives under no sort of government with the lawful liberty of a subject who is protected by a civil government. And that government, instead of being the creature of the people or the result of a convention between them and their rulers, is the creature of God. And when considered in the theory, is the cause and not the result of such a convention, as the doctor speaks. He says, the doctor's argument, I fear, is invidious. What would he think of my candor if, treading in his steps, I reflected on the subordination of wives to their husbands, soldiers to their generals, flocks to their pastors, servants to their masters, and creatures to their creator in the same manner in which he reflects on the subordination of subjects to their sovereigns? And he goes on and says, it'll overthrow everything. Dr. Price's position that all legislative power originates in the people is groundless, and everybody takes it for granted. Dabney said the same thing. It's a mischievous supposition which is directly contrary to Scripture and reason. The people, he says, that is the governed, can no more create governing or legislative power and bestow it upon the members of parliament whom they choose than the aldermen who have the right of choosing a mayor can create a mayoralty. No more than the women who have the right of choosing a husband can create masculine supremacy. No more than the servants who have a chosen master can create masterly power. Or the soldiers who choose to list under this or that captain rather than another can create a military authority to which they submit. He says, permit me to hand you out of your imaginary paradise of legislation. And he goes on. He said, if people did this right, if were this observation properly attended to, our lawgivers would study Christian politics with assiduity, that they might fully understand the will of God, the supreme lawgiver, whom they represent. But instead, all politicians do is manipulate the people. Because if the people are the source of authority, then you just manipulate them. And there's no truth. It's just one absurd manipulation after another. But if God is the source, and you're supposed to be listening to God's voice and not the people's voice, then you study Christian politics. And only those who are well studied in Christian politics, just like you wouldn't have somebody work on your teeth, do a heart surgery, overhaul your engine unless you knew they were really good. But we put people in power who are only good at playing with the voice of the people, claiming to represent the people. Well, how about representing God? That's Fletcher's whole point. You're supposed to represent God. He says, as this notion is contrary to Scripture, so it is to reason. For reason dictates that if governing power came from the people might, whenever they please, choose to disobey their governors and would have a right to do so. Talk to these kids out here. Let me tell you, they know they have their rights. And based on our principles, unfortunately, they're in the right and they're winning. They can go down and burn down the city of Chicago. I guess we can't do anything about it. They can burn down Portland. They can burn down Minneapolis, and we're just going to go, I guess they have a right to. He says, I conclude that whenever you and Dr. Price teach that the power of the governors originates from or is delegated by the governed, you sap the foundation of all government and indirectly bring in the lawless democracy. Same thing Dabney was saying. Which a sacred historian describes where he says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. He says, therefore, the power of the general and other officers is delegated by and originates from the soldiers. He was given an example in the military. So the authority of the general comes from the soldiers. Can you believe it? Equally conclusive, O ye American patriots, is your grand argument concerning the origin of power. And then he goes on, and he actually quotes a speech imitating Satan. He's saying, here's the speech that Satan gave fictitiously in Milton's Paradise Lost. This argument of self-government, the British are trying to tyrannize us, and we're just trying to practice self-government. And he destroys it. He quotes Satan, thou art struggling for dominion over others, we for self-dominion, the noblest of all blessings. Fletcher writes, this seditious sophism is sufficient to fill us with a just detestation of Dr. Price's politics. But a scheme which has a direct tendency so to level authority, so to subvert all government, and abolish all subordination in the universe, such a scheme, I say, cannot be too strongly opposed. It should be totally extirpated. Archimedes said once, give me a point on which I may fix my engine and I will move the earth out of its place. And I may say, give me Dr. Price's political principles and I will move all kings out of their thrones and all subjection out of the world. But part of how it's happening, Dabney said, is in the marriage. When kids are brought up with this ideology running the home, nobody's in charge. The husband has no more authority over the wife as the wife over him. You got two authorities. This will produce children that are more akin to devils than to men. That's what Dabney said. I once had 25 years ago, I did a show on something related to this, and a lady wrote me a letter, and I had a bunch of the youth from church. They'd spend the afternoon with me, and we went into this sports store just to kill some time, I guess. And the lady came up to me, and she's the one that wrote me the letter. And I kind of lost memory of that letter, and she explained the letter to me, but the gist of it was, I was probably in my 40s, she's in her 60s, and she came from a large family, but she said, my dad was henpecked. And all of us, all my siblings, to this day, are totally messed up. Because we grew up in a home where the dad was henpecked. He did not lead like he was supposed to. He was not commanding his household. He was not ruling his home well. And she grew up with a mother that was contentious, that was usurping. It's a disaster. And that's what we have across the board. That's your average home now. So he goes through that whole speech by the devil. And he goes here, I need not tell you, sir, that this speech of the patriotic seraph, Satan, is formed upon the principles laid down in Dr. Price's pamphlet. You easily discern not only his sentiments, but his very words and doctrine. So Satan is arguing his case, saying he's right. He persuaded 1/3 of the angels. That's kind of what traditional Christianity has believed. That he had a strong argument. He won 1/3 of the angels over to his argument. It's a powerful argument. And Fletcher says it's the same argument of the American patriots. But it's ultimately rebellion. And all throughout the Old Testament, Jeremiah especially, you have prophets speaking in the name of God, and it's rebellion. And if you don't discern that's rebellion, well, the prophets that taught rebellion were going to be killed. God killed one and ostracized the one, Hananiah and then Shemaiah. And if you're following teaching that is teaching rebellion, you're in trouble. Should you reply that the case of creatures is different from that of subjects, because creatures owe more to God than subjects to an earthly sovereign? I grant it, and assert that on this account obedience to the true God is preserved in the first table of the law, and reasonable subjection to our rightful sovereign in the second table. The former is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it in dignity and importance. Therefore, St. Peter says, fear God and honor the king. If your doctrine directly or indirectly strikes at the authority of God and Caesar, as the two preceding speeches show it does, how dangerous is your patriotism? How dangerous is it? And then he closes and says, talking to all the ministers, he said, as a minister in the Anglican Church, should you wonder, sir, at my repeated opposition to your principles, I shall urge two things by way of apology for it. He says, as a minister of the Church of England, I have subscribed to the doctrine of the homily against disobedience and willful rebellion. So they all had to sign on. And he quotes from what they all signed on to. Quote, God of his infinite mercy grant unto us, the ministers, that we may be good, natural, loving, and obedient subjects, not only showing all obedience ourselves, but as many of us as are able, to the utmost of our power, ability, and understanding, to stay and repress all rebels and rebellions against God, our gracious Prince and natural country, at every occasion that is offered unto us, and that which we are all able to do, unless we do it, we shall be most wicked and most worthy to feel in the end such extreme plagues as God has ever poured upon rebels. I produce this quotation not to charge you, sir, or Dr. Price, with disobedience and willful rebellion, for I firmly believe you intend no such thing. I don't know if I agree. I only want to remind you that by my subscriptions as a minister, my baptism as a Christian, and my oath of allegiance as a subject, I am bound, at the occasion offered me by your reply and your quotations, to do what I am able to do in order to rectify your mistakes and guard my readers against what appears to me the natural tendency of your principles. And that's what Dabney pointed out, that with evolution removing Adam as the source of all authority and patriarchy going, so now the home is being run the opposite. I mean, the devil's getting his way. Paul wrote in Titus that false teachers will come in trying to subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not to for filthy lucre's sake. And the elder's job is to be attacking that, attacking the rebellious thought, undermining all these relationships that Paul describes as sound doctrine, undermining every relationship, husband to wife, children to parents, slave to master. If the church isn't fighting to establish those relationships properly, the man ruling well, the wife submitting well, obeying well, that's gone. We don't even have these principles operating in the Christian home. It's all mutual submission. Hopefully this helps you try to trace where this came from, the social contract theory that says that our natural, that we really are independent. I'm just going to leave it at that. This is Peter Helland on the show Israel, and Israel is the name that Matthew gave to Jesus from Hosea of 11. And if you have been baptized into Christ and you've taken on Christ, you believe in Jesus Christ, then you become part of Israel. You are the true Israel, the Israel of God, Paul says. And you are now an inheritor of the promise to Abraham and his seed, Jesus Christ. You inherit the promise to rule the world. The new heaven and new earth that is coming, that's where our hope is. It's promised to the true Israel. So till next time, Peter Helland.